Welcome to today's episode of Falling to Freedom, where addiction ends and faith begins, the weekly podcast that brings thoughtful, informed, and challenging discussions about addiction to the forefront of everyone's minds. We join our host now, Chad Lacombe, for today's topic.
All right, well, welcome to our initial episode of Falling to Freedom, where addiction ends and faith begins. We're excited to get this podcast going, and so I'm going to be your host. My name's Chad Lacombe, and this is my friend and co-host, Victor Almares.
Pleasure to be with you today, Chad. It's been amazing to see your journey, man, and to get to know you over the last several months, and just to see what God has done in your life, from just where we've come in our backgrounds to where God has each of our lives today is just such a blessing, man. It's an honor to be a part of this discussion with you today.
Cool. Looking forward to it. So the vision for this podcast is really to open up a discussion about addiction, because I think addiction is one of those things that, you know, every family deals with, but nobody likes to talk about. It's that dirty little secret that everybody likes to keep hidden behind closed doors. I really am convinced more and more that this is a whole of society problem, and that we would probably be hard-pressed to find a family that either within their immediate family or their extended family either has dealt with addiction or is dealing with addiction. But because people don't like to talk about it, you know, it seems like, well, we're the only ones dealing with this. It's just our family that's going through this, and we don't want to air our dirty laundry for other people to see, but it's just not the case. That a lot of families are dealing with this to one degree or another. So I think this conversation that we're going to be having is needed.
In my journey in recovery, I've called that the inevitable repercussionary effect of addiction. That this just inevitably, that lives are touched and impacted by the fact that people struggle with addiction. So I think it's a relevant conversation. So yeah, what's your vision for the show, Chad?
So the vision for the show is interviewing guests from a whole range of perspectives. Right? Sometimes it might be the addict that is going through it. It might be the family of the addict. It might be the children of the addict. It might be a professional that can speak to the physiological effects of addiction or why fentanyl is so bad. We might have discussions about addiction and the intersection with crime. So having law enforcement on here to speak about their perspective, or the homelessness issue. I mean, all of these topics can be approached from multiple directions just on each individual topic. And so the vision is to start to open up these discussions with people and talk, you know, maybe 30 minutes to an hour about them. And kind of the driving thought behind these podcasts is thoughtful, informed, and challenging discussions. So let me kind of just unpack those. Thoughtful meaning thought-provoking. So when we're having conversations, I'm anticipating guests that are really going to be talking about things that maybe people have, you know, thought about maybe, or maybe they haven't thought about. And as they're hearing this discussion, it's really getting their mind going about the issues. But also thoughtful in the sense that answering questions that people have. Right, so we want to anticipate the type of questions that people would have about these issues, and then have guests speak to it that are answering, you know, those questions. Informed is saying that the guests that we have on here are going to know what they're talking about. They're either going to know from personal experience or shared experience with people that are going through it, or this is their profession. So law enforcement, we're not going to have, you know, you or I speak on that. That's going to be someone that is actively in law enforcement. So they're going to know what they're talking about. Or if it's the physiological effects of addiction, it's going to be a doctor that is speaking about these things. And then challenging, because these topics that we're going to discuss are going to be challenging. They're not going to always be the easiest things to talk about. You know, addiction is one of those things that people oftentimes don't like to talk about. There's going to be some hard discussions. There's going to be some heart-wrenching revelations, and it will challenge people. But also on the solution side, I think it's going to challenge people's preconceived ideas about what addiction is and how we tackle this problem.
And I know you've got an excellent array of perspectives to be able to look at the challenge of addiction, and a series of guests already lined up, and we're going to unpack that here shortly. But would also like to understand for our listeners, I think it would be beneficial for them to know why we want to talk about this topic, what qualifies us as people with lived experience, our perspectives on this as well. So maybe we should unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't mind, I'll go first and just kind of share a little bit of my history with it. Of course, we're not just sitting here with no experience about this and just popped in our heads, well, let's just talk about addiction, right? It's a big part of who we were and, you know, in a lot of ways shaped who we are today. And so for me, it started when I was about 12 years old. 12 years old, started smoking cigarettes, drinking, quickly progressed into smoking marijuana. There were some things going on in my life, but I started hanging around people that were involved in these types of things. And I was always the type of kid that wanted to take things to the extreme, right? Which is not a good thing when you're a drug addict, because you find yourself doing things that you never thought were possible. By the time I was 15 years old, I was using methamphetamine. At that point, I had already been arrested for 2 grand theft autos, in and out of drug treatment programs. My addiction kept progressing to the point where by the time I was 21 years old, I was going off to prison, you know, for a crime that I committed that I never would have committed had I not been on drugs. You know, I was in and out of a lot of drug treatment programs when I was younger. Prior to going to prison, I went to, you know, some STEP programs. I went to some, you know, hospital dry out programs. I was even in a long-term residential treatment program. And, you know, like a lot of people that really battle with addiction, it was one of those roller coaster rides in life. Ups and downs. And when I was sober and doing good, life was up and things were great, and I'd be, you know, moving towards prosperity in its own way, not necessarily financially, but just being successful in life and, you know, moving along. But then during addiction, I would hit these valleys and things would just fall apart, and I would destroy opportunities and relationships in my life. And it felt like a vicious cycle that I could not get off of. Needless to say, it just took me to some depths that were not pleasant, eventually ending me in prison, where I was in prison for 15 years. So a pretty good length of time because of the choices that I was making. But eventually, I found sobriety, and for me, it was through a relationship with Christ, and I was able to be freed from that addiction. And coming out of prison, wanting to, you know, be involved in things, ministry things. Actually, this type of effort wasn't even initially in my thoughts, but it became clear afterwards that no, this is where, because of the past that I've lived, this is where the efforts need to be, and it's much needed. And so I'm super excited about not only being a part of this conversation, but, you know, you and I have talked about Fully Restored Ministries, helping men to, you know, be free from addiction through a Christ-centered pastoral care model that also includes equipping or preparation for the future. So yeah, that's really my journey right there. And I know from my own personal experience the depths that addiction can take a person, but I know that there's also freedom and hope and a way out of that as well. And so, you know, the first step in that is just bringing those things that are in the darkness into the light. So,
excellent.
What about you? I mean, you have a similar, maybe not the same details, but you have a past as well. And so why don't you share with listeners what your past is?
Yeah, so I grew up in a military family. I'm also a pastor's kid growing up as well. So the Jesus culture, the Jesus revolution, that whole amazing dynamic that took place that transformed so many lives. My brother and I were the kids that were kind of hanging out, playing with Hot Wheels and and listening to the adults, and certainly there was oftentimes a Bible and a guitar and a place of worship and a Bible study that would come forth. And so I grew up in a relationship with Jesus. I made a decision as a young kid to come forward and respond, but I didn't know anything about addiction and what it meant to have a different physiological response in my body to alcohol and the effects of alcohol, nor did I have any awareness or understanding of the fact that once I had a taste for that I would want to run further with it. And over the years, coming to understand that there is a solution, that I have come to walk in that solution, engage in that process as well. So, but while you were talking about your experience as well, and as I think through mine, and on the topics that we're going to be addressing in this podcast, it for me as a sports guy, in all of the transitions and moving around and going to 16 public schools, I found a refuge on the athletic field. There was consistency, there's rules. Playing basketball in Arkansas, or playing tennis in Newport, Rhode Island, or playing baseball on Okinawa, Japan, on the island there. 3 strikes and you're out. Put the ball in the goalpost. But this discussion and the opportunity in this podcast, it seems as though we're going to be able to provide perspective from lived experience. It's like having a quarterback who has called audibles in a play, or been on the field in real time while scenarios are developing and unfolding. I'm excited about what we're doing. I'm excited about what God's done in each of our lives and in the lives of people that God is bringing to the discussion as well. We've already developed a network of people that are supporting what we're doing here in a lot of ways. And so it's really cool to see that community develop. And that's part of the recovery journey as well.
This is a whole of society problem, right? I mean, there's no area that it doesn't touch. And when you said you were a pastor's kid, I mean, the thought that came to my mind was, so you mean growing up in a Christian home or even growing up in the church is no guarantee that you're not going to become an addict? Well, no. Yeah, I mean, it's like it touches every person's life, but there's probably a lot of people out there that, feel like we can't share this dirty little secret.
It is a stronghold of addiction to live in a certain amount of shame and guilt and to feel that condemnation. And also for people who have struggled, who maybe have a business or operating in a pastoral role even, or a police officer, like there's no limitations to who is going to be affected and impacted by the inevitable consequence of the struggle with addiction, for sure, whether it's alcohol, prescription drugs, meth, heroin, fentanyl, and I think it's important for our listeners to understand that we're committed to the authenticity, to the conversation, to getting out on the edge, with also being aware of the fact that people may be in their car, they may be in their living room. I think that's part of the art and the craft of the conversation that we're going to have is let's get real about this. Let's get transparent about our journey in this and the fact that there is a solution, that we're engaged in that solution. But also let's not be shy about the fact that people's lives are literally on the line. Oftentimes in my journey of recovery and sobriety, I get passionate and I share. If you hear passion in me, it's because I live this as though my life depends upon it, because it does.
So you're saying we're not going to sugarcoat it?
Correct. And I think that's part of the draw, man. I think people are actually going to be attracted to that because I think that there's actually going to be a sense of relief that we're putting these conversations out in real time, especially with the guests that we have lined up and the topics that we're going to discuss, which I think it might be a good time, Chad, to kind of talk about some of the areas that you want to engage in and what drives this thoughtful, informed, and challenging conversation and where we're going to go with it.
Yeah, sure. And I think there's no limit to the topics and conversations because addiction touches, every facet of life. But some prominent ones pop into our minds. Homelessness, right? So we know from experience, certainly I know from experience, that a large portion of long-term homelessness is because of addiction. There might be short-term homelessness issues that are caused by other things, but a lot of times the long-term homelessness is either mental illness, which that can be caused by a life of addiction. Sometimes people's minds are just fried from the drugs that they were doing. but the desire to continue in their addiction free from any responsibilities. A lot of times shelters will have requirements in order to be there. So the issue for these people is not a housing issue. It's not even a money issue, right? California has spent billions of dollars in the last decade, and the problem's only gotten worse. So it's not a money issue. And for a lot of these people, they don't want to be bound by a curfew. They don't want to drug test. They don't want to have to actively be looking for a job. So the intersection between homelessness and addiction is very real. So we want to have discussions on that. Fatherlessness. A lot of times there's drugs involved and addiction involved with these, unwanted pregnancies, we should say, right? That people are doing things that they shouldn't be, and, the inevitable happens. And so, because of addiction, you're probably not going to have the healthiest of relationships if both people are addicts, and then enter into the equation a child. So that just complicates the situation. So that's another one. I think crime is a big one. So having been to prison myself, I know that a large portion of the people that are in prison, while their cases may not be drug related, as was my case, they wouldn't have done the things they were doing if they weren't addicted. If they weren't addicts and they weren't living that lifestyle, they wouldn't have committed those crimes. Some other ones would be prescription drugs. Huge problem of people, taking prescription drugs, often for legitimate reasons, probably overprescribed by doctors, and then that leading to a full-blown heroin addiction or just under dependence on those prescription drugs. Overdose is a huge part, especially with fentanyl in our society today. So that would be a topic. And young people succumbing to the effects of fentanyl, maybe even unwittingly. I had a statistic here that I found recently out of the Journal of American Medical Association, and it says that they examined more than 3.3 million deaths of U.S. adults aged 25 to 44. So these were younger to middle-aged people between 1999 and 2023. There are two distinct trends in rise in mortality, with a rise from 2011 to 2019, and then another even more significant rise from 2020 to 2023. Makes sense with the whole COVID pandemic and people just having to deal with, the effects of being at home and isolated from other people, which was not a good thing. But unnatural causes of death, such as drug poisoning, were the leading cause of death in young adults. Drug poisoning has been the leading cause of death among young adults since 2014, with a sharp rise in 2020 and a stable excess death rate since. So drug poisoning would be, that high school student, that college student that takes some pills at a rave or a party, doesn't realize that it's laced with fentanyl and ends up dying because that drug is so potent.
Certainly the drug epidemic that's occurring currently, along with the issues of alcohol. I read a statistic recently that almost 500 people every single day die of alcohol-related death, whether it be long-term health issues or, a car accident or something happening, a devastating event that's occurring in real time. So with billions of dollars having been spent and probably thousands of people wanting to talk about addiction and homelessness and PTSD and trauma, certainly the conversation expands into first responders, law enforcement, firefighters, our veterans experiencing various types of trauma out on the battlefield, even not in the battlefield and not even during wartime. But so there certainly is a depth of conversation to have here. So I'd really love to touch also on what differentiates this podcast and who you have planned on coming to the show, and some of the topics that we're going to discuss, like some of the conversations that we can unpack with people, so that our listeners have an ongoing reason to stay connected with the podcast and follow the conversation as well.
I think what's going to set it apart is just having these real, unfiltered conversations with people that have either gone through it or are dealing with it. You mentioned first responders, and a lot of times people don't realize the impact that it has on their health, right? If you are a paramedic or firefighter and you have to go out, multiple times a day to bring somebody back to life that OD'd on drugs, that can really cause a callousness in a person's heart, and in some cases even make them really hate those people for what they're doing, and that's damaging to that person themselves. And so having these conversations are going to be real, unfiltered, hard conversation sometimes, but I think eye-opening for people. And so some of the first guests that we already have lined up, and we're hoping when we drop this initial podcast, this introduction, that we'll have 4 or 5 more. One of them is going to be on prescription drugs. I have a gentleman named Tim Torres who is that typical picture of someone that had an injury, started taking some prescription drugs, some opiates, and eventually that turned into a full-blown heroin addiction that, kept him in bondage for a long time. So I don't think that story is unique to him, and people have questions. Does that mean that, nobody should take prescription drugs? No, right? But there certainly have to be some boundaries and understand the danger in it.
I think on the topic of addiction, one of the consistent things that we'll find, it'll probably likely become a thread in the conversation is people might say something like, when I started taking an opioid for pain or after a surgery, I never set out to start sticking a needle in my arm or, selling my stuff or lying to my employer to have money to support this addiction. I think that we'll discover and be able to unpack with people some of the variables that people experience as they walk through a life of addiction and come out on the other side. And I think the same thing with the first responders and law enforcement. I don't think that a police officer, for example, ever set out to serve his community or her community in a law enforcement career, and then to eventually to say, oh yeah, I'll become callous to the fact that people that are homeless OD on drugs, but sometimes that process happens. And it'll be interesting, I think, to unpack how people get through that, how they work through that, and stay sensitive and aware and thoughtful about how they interact with people that are experiencing the challenges of addiction as well. We're laying a phenomenal groundwork on this ongoing discussion, and I think people will be intrigued and fascinated and provoke some thought, potentially into a course of action as well. So what are some other things that you consider discussing on the podcast, Chad?
I think a pretty interesting one is going to be the tragedy of overdose. So, nobody could probably argue that when somebody overdoses, it's horrible. It's tragic, not only for them, but for their family, society. And so with a lot of these topics, I think we're gonna be able to discuss them from multiple perspectives on separate episodes. Like with this one of the first people we're gonna have is Nicole. She's a Riverside County Sheriff's coroner. And so getting her perspective, from a coroner's perspective, on the tragedy of overdose will be enlightening. But we can also talk about this in future episodes with maybe a parent or a spouse of someone that did OD, and heart-wrenching as that will be, it's needed in the conversation.
I was absolutely blown away when I was in a conversation with somebody in active recovery that I had shared the fact that they had overdosed 20 times.
Wow. And
could certainly, on any of those occasions, been one of the people, laying on the corners in their work environment, and having a tragic experience, but somehow through recovery, experienced a transformed life. So, it'll be interesting to hear those perspectives, because I can't duplicate that. I can't talk on that topic, but somebody who's lived it out.
Yeah. What also made me think about what you just said is, you were talking about a second ago with first responders. I mean, this guy, 20-something times that he OD'd. So who brought him back? Right? Maybe sometimes it was somebody that he was doing drugs with, but more than likely, most of those times, it's a first responder. Might have been the same first responder multiple times, bringing this same person back, you can see where something like that could really cause someone to be callous, towards the situation.
It'll be intriguing to have the conversations, certainly with people that are, firsthand there. So what are some of the other conversations that you have already in mind for the upcoming episodes?
Okay, so I want to have one on fatherlessness. So Jessica Alexander is the director of a ministry called Birth Choice Center. And so they deal with pregnancies and giving girls an option other than an abortion. But the other side of that pregnancy is the man, right? It takes two to tango. And so the reality is that a lot of times there's drugs involved and a woman gets pregnant, and addicts are not the most responsible people, and so you could certainly see the guy taken off, and now you have this young girl often with a pregnancy and trying to figure out what to do and wanting to do hopefully the right thing. And so that's where birth choice comes in. So Jessica will be speaking how addiction and fatherlessness intersect in the things that she's involved in.
Yeah, so there's this idea of reps or repetitions. Certainly athletes do that to develop muscle memory given situations and circumstances. I'm always intrigued when a team is in a critical situation and they can steal a base or lay down a bunt at a critical moment in time. And to have people that are qualified either from a clinical, professional, lived experience, that are qualified to address the issues of addiction in real time. We get reps. And I know that that's been the case for me in interacting with people in recovery and in sobriety. I don't know that there's much that would surprise me now. Like, I mean, occasionally I hear something that's that's stunning. But the reality is a lot of our guests are going to have experienced multiple reps. So for a person who's come back from an overdose 20 times, there are police officers, first responders, and clinicians who know probably multiple people that have experienced something like that and beyond. So gaining the insight from the upcoming guests and the repetitions and the perspectives that they've lived through and experienced will certainly bring value to the show as well.
Another topic that we certainly want to discuss here is the reality that sometimes in addiction, it results in the loss of custody of children, right? So you have children involved here, and let's just say a mother is addicted to heroin or speed or whatever it may be, and it's gotten so bad that the authorities have to step in, or sometimes family members have to step in and take custody of that child. And so we have an upcoming guest, Brooke, who's going to be sharing her personal experience in that. It's heart-wrenching, to realize that the consequences of addiction, are real and they affect people's lives. And so she's going to share, from her perspective. And this is another one, it could be her perspective. We could get a time where you have the child that was, had to be given up custody, their perspective, or the parents, because often it's the parents that will take custody of the children when their child is an addict. So this one will be another one of those heart-wrenching topics that will be enlightening. One last guest is going to be Micah Tucker, and he's going to be talking about homelessness and addiction. So he's involved with CityLink, and they're out there in the streets with people every day. And so getting his perspective on the intersection of addiction and homelessness is going to be good too.
It'll be beneficial for folks to hear the positive side of it as well. It's always it's always intriguing when we hear the challenging aspect of things, and it can be sometimes it can be difficult to go down that path without getting to the other side. So I think for our listeners, it might be interesting to hear what you're doing actively, unless you want to talk about more of the guests. But I'd also love to hear what you're doing actively in your life and kind of what God has done in your life. I know I'm anxious to share a little bit about that in my journey as well. And so what's going on with Chad?
So today I am the associate pastor of Calvary Chapel Temecula, actively involved there Fully Restored Ministries, actively involved there, trying to have a solution, be a part of the solution for, men coming out of addiction. And this podcast, right, opening up the conversation to people. So, I know that my freedom from addiction was through a relationship with Christ. And, more than just being sober, it's like living in victory. And so, I hope in the future that we'll have opportunities to share more about that, depending on the conversations we're having. But yeah, that's kind of what's going on in my life. What about you?
Yeah, thanks for asking. What a wonderful opportunity to share about the love of God and the faithfulness of God as well, man. And in 1999, I reached out for help, and it was like, oh, you have a job, you have, a car, you spend time with your son. Not sure there's much we could do with, for you. And I was like, spiritually inside, internally, I was dying. And I was like, my spiritual level of fitness was non-existent. I was very desperate for something. And so I started reaching out, tapping into resources. And over this course of 25 plus years, I kind of refer to it as my quest for the heart of God, toward the heart of God. And in that journey, I've been able to tap in and realize that my faith, my relationship with the Lord, my sobriety and my active step work engagement there, and my mental health journey as well, it all creates a pathway into my Father's heart. And it's all, biblically based and Christ-centered, and super grateful for that journey. And the opportunity to be able to tap into multiple resources, which we're also going to engage in these conversations as well, bring resources to the conversation and into people's, the forefront of their minds, has been a real blessing. And to use best practices given these different environments and to be able to apply them in such a way. And, oftentimes I talk about the inevitable consequence of addiction and the behavior and the lives that are impacted by that. But walking with God has an inevitable consequence as well. When I'm intentional and I'm surrendered and obedient and responsive to the Spirit of God and pursuing the things that He would have me do, means being in relationship with others and being others oriented as well. So my relationship with God, with myself, and with others has been transformed in this process and in this journey. And I look forward to sharing more of that on the podcast and beyond as well.
Cool. Well, as we conclude, this initial podcast, we also want to recognize that, there may be people that are listening to this podcast that are dealing with addiction at this moment, right? They may be listening to this and looking for some hope and looking for some answers and a path out of it. There may even be some that are contemplating, ending their life because of it. And so we want to certainly let people know that there's options out there. There's a lot of options out there. And one is calling 988. It's a 24/7 national crisis hotline. Recovery is real, and hope is stronger than despair. And there's a lot of people and a lot of resources that want to help, and we don't want to ever leave somebody not realizing that there's hope out there. So if you are struggling with any of these things and you don't have resources right at this moment, please call 988. And again, it's a free 24/7 helpline. There's counselors that are ready to listen, talk with you, and hopefully direct you towards something in your area that can help.
Excellent.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Thank you for being a part of this much-needed conversation as we expose the raw truths about addiction. Don't forget to like, follow, and most importantly, share. Remember, addiction is the dirty little secret that every family deals with, but nobody wants to talk about.